What if WCW had won the Monday Night Wars? A question that many a fan, I'm sure, has asked themselves. And while plenty of those fans probably think they would have been better off, the question remains, is there any way that this actually could have happened? Well, that's the subject of this video, because today... Please support this channel by subscribing, and you could support it even further by signing up over on my Patreon page, just like with Ron Hawthorne and Mangy Stray. Thank you and the rest of the Patrons for all the amazing support as you keep this channel going. Alright, first off, and obviously enough, nobody knows for certain what would have happened in an alternate dimension where World Championship Wrestling came out on top over that of the WWF. This is simply a hypothetical that I'm pitching, as I think that it's a plausible scenario where WCW would have become the victor of the Monday Night Wars. And of course, there are going to be a lot of specifics that I just don't have the time to get into, so I decided to lay out my plan in 3 overarching parts. And for the first part, well, let's just go ahead and get into it. Okay, so the first thing that WCW has to do in order to win the war, obviously enough, is that they have to survive it. Now, under this specific scenario, the AOL merger, of course, is still going to happen. And with that, it might seem like there's no way for WCW to stay afloat and not get sold to WWE. Or is there? Well, first things first, I am going to say that I do have a scenario that I think is fairly plausible. And no, it doesn't concern Eric Bischoff buying the company. While there are many reports of that being close to happening, it's not the route I'm going for today, as I think cold hard cash is the way to win this war. And Eazy-E doesn't exactly have deeper pockets than billionaire Ted. And yes, I am perfectly aware that Ted Turner wasn't in charge at the time, I'm just using his name as shorthand. My point of the matter is that AOL Time Warner had a much bigger bankroll than that of Eric Bischoff. And so if WCW is going to win this thing, I say follow the money. But now that we've said that, how exactly are we going to get them to not cut WCW loose? Well, the answer is, yet again, money. In 1999, WCW was losing millions, and that would only get worse until they were sold. And so if we're going to get AOL Time Warner to see that they're worth something, well, they're actually going to have to be worth something, and worth a lot at that. Now yes, Time Warner did own the Atlanta Braves, and they were generating considerably more money than WCW, as they were worth around $500 million, and yet they still got the axe from Time Warner in 2007. And so how could a company that was allegedly losing $62 million in 2001, and according to some sources, the company never actually made money at all, but I do find that hard to believe. And that's the problem with a lot of professional wrestling news, you never know what is real and what isn't. Anyway, back to the lecture at hand. Now that we established that the Atlanta Braves stayed with AOL Time Warner until the mid-2000s, for WCW to do the same, they have to do just as good as the Braves did, if not better. Which means that they have to generate at a minimum $500 million, and that's a pretty tall task for any professional wrestling company. But it's not impossible, as there was one promotion that did it. Of course, that's the WWF. In 2005, it was the first time that WWE was worth over $1 billion. And back in 2001, they were worth an amazing $950 million, which is still pretty good. And it would be about double of what the Atlanta Braves were worth. And with that, let's just remember what happened in WWE back in 2001. Oh, that's right, they bought WCW. And so, I submit to you that in order for WCW to win the war, they have to win the war. Okay, I guess that sounds a little ridiculous, but my point of the matter is that I think if WCW could generate $1 billion, then they would at least be able to be kept afloat, and that AOL Time Warner would in the least decide to keep them. And if they were just capable of pouncing on the WWF when they were at their most vulnerable, like in 1998 or in 2000, then I think WCW would have put the WWF away for good, and therefore have won the war. If Vince McMahon was the one who had to close up shop, then we might have seen things on the reverse, with World Championship Wrestling buying the WWF instead. And with that, I think they would have been able to generate the $1 billion per year revenue that we were just talking about. But wait a second, what did I mean when I said that WCW should have pounced on them when they were at their most vulnerable? Well, that leads us to the second part of my strategy, where I think it's all about really good storytelling, something that WCW definitely lacked in those vulnerable years for the WWF. And so with that being said, let's get into the next phase. Alright, I'm not gonna go over each and every one of WCW's creative problems and what I would have done instead. But what I am gonna do is I'm gonna take a broader look at some creative categories, if you will, and talk about the problems within them. And to start, what I would say is one of the biggest problems that WCW had when it came to what to do with the talent is that they had way too much talent to begin with. Okay, now we're gonna have to keep a few guys around just as jobbers, but for the most part, the first leg of the strategy is to trim down WCW's roster a lot. This is gonna save money, and it's also gonna save screen time, as we're not gonna keep many people around who can't move the needle. I wanna whittle the whole thing down to just about 50 guys. And yes, 50 wrestlers wouldn't even leave us enough for World War III, but as I established earlier, it's all about them ducats. And so, having a third ring taking up perfectly good floor seating that you could charge a lot of money for? Not on my watch. You're lucky I'm letting you keep War Games. So this means guys like your Horace Hogans, your Disco Infernos, and your Scott Norrens aren't going to see the light of day. In fact, I might just reach my goal if I get rid of all the non-essential NWO members in and of themselves. Now, I'm not going to sit here and go over every single person on the old WCW roster that I would cut. I think you get the point. But while I'm on the topic, there is another category of talent that I would release as well. Or more specifically, I wouldn't even hire in the first place. And that's the celebrities. Now, we know from the actual Monday Night Wars that these celebrities aren't going to help us win this thing, and therefore, why waste the money, why waste the airtime when those resources could be better used somewhere else? And so, this means no Karl Malone, no Dennis Rodman, no Kevin Green, no Mongo McMichael, and certainly no Tank Abbott or David Arquette. And look, just shut up in the comment section for anyone who wants to say, I think you're being too harsh on Arquette. Good for you, you saw a documentary and you're a sucker for it. David Arquette sucks, deal with it. Okay, so enough about all the wrestlers who are getting the axe. What about the wrestlers that are staying on board? What do we do with them? Well, the way I see it, after 1996 and 1997, WWF was having record low numbers. And so, if we really put the screws to them in 1998, that might have finished the deal. The only problem is the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Almost just as soon as Stone Cold Steve Austin won the WWF World Championship at WrestleMania and began the Austin McMahon feud, we saw the 83 weeks come to a close. And so, from now on, our main objective here is to try to put a stop to Stunning Steve. But, at the same time, during this time, there were 3 superstars that were all due for that World Championship Wrestling title. The only problem is, you couldn't give it to them all at once, and even still, which one of them would have been the best choice to go against Steve Austin? If any of them at all. Well, let's just stop to break it all down. Who are these 3 wrestlers? First, you have Sting, that was wrapping up his storyline with the NWO. And then there was Bret Hart, who was coming fresh off of the Montreal Screwjob. And of course, there was the big sensation of 1998, Bill Goldberg. And so, creatively speaking, what's the best way to handle all 3 of these wrestlers? Well, when it comes to Bill Goldberg, while some of you might disagree with this, my strategy would be to keep him on the shelf. As we already established, 1998 is a very important year, and while Big Bill during his title reign did win a couple of Mondays, it's about the long-term victory that we need, something that we know Bill can't do. So instead, I think we're better off postponing his meteoric rise till 1999, or maybe even all the way till 2000, because as I established, that is also another important year, because that's the year that Stone Cold Steve Austin isn't around, thus making the WWF more vulnerable. So that's what we're gonna do with Goldberg, but how about the other 2 talents? Well, as far as Sting is concerned, as much as I like him and as much as he deserves to have a proper payoff with the NWO storyline, I don't think he's quite the right person to take on Austin. But this doesn't mean that we're not gonna give him the belt. So to be clear, Starrcade 1997 ends the right way, with Hogan tapping out right in the middle of the ring and no Bret Hart at all. But in order to make sure that he doesn't go against Austin in the Monday Night Wars carrying the company on his back as champion, he's simply just going to have to drop it before the upcoming WrestleMania, which is when Austin wins the belt. Meanwhile, now that we talked about Bret Hart, the rule here is if he's injured and can't wrestle because of his hand, then he's not going to appear on TV. He's not going to debut until we know for sure that we could use him. And when he does debut, we're going to use his momentum and his sympathy from the Screwjob and parlay that into him eventually going against Sting. And this is going to be a big build, really playing off of the similarities of their finishers. And Bret is going to come out on top. But even with all that, I don't think that Bret is going to be able to beat the Austin McMahon feud. However, I do think he's going to put a bigger dent in it than Sting could. All the same, this is exactly why the Hitman's reign isn't going to last very long, as he's going to wind up having a dream match against Hulk Hogan. And even though many people might not like this, Hollywood Hogan is going to be the one that goes over. Now, the reason reason for this is because during Austin's first 2 title reigns, remember he dropped the belt to Kane at King of the Ring only to win it back the next night on Raw, so his first 2 title reigns really just count as one long one, is because during Austin's first 2 title reigns, the only other WCW World Champion to win on Monday other than Bill Goldberg was Hollywood Hogan. And so, if we're gonna postpone Goldberg, then Hollywood Hogan would be the next best thing. And furthermore, Hollywood Hogan is also being used here because he's gonna be setting up the next major star of the company. And this is where the biggest part of the strategy comes in, because Hogan's gonna be setting up the only person in existence that I think really could have brought down Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that's The Rock. Yup, that's right, it's the Great One who I predict could be the best possible weapon that WCW ever had in order to beat the WWF. And while this does seem like a long shot since Dwayne Johnson is a pure WWE loyalist, let's remember that his loyalty may not have always been set in stone. Now I will give you, this does require an incredible amount of foresight. After all, who could ever have predicted that Dwayne Johnson would have become the megastar that he was? But nevertheless, this is the strategy, as I think The Rock is the only person that could possibly fade that of Stone Cold Steve Austin. So now, let's go back to 1996. Back to when a young Rocky Maivia made his debut. And ironically enough, back then he wasn't loved, he was actually hated. Really hated. And I'm not just talking about by screaming fans who hated how squeaky clean of a babyface he was, but I'm also talking about the real life backstage bullying that he got from both Triple H and Shawn Michaels, who allegedly disrespected The Rock's grandmother. So in this scenario, WCW would see the star power in The Rock, and pouncing in on him when he's vulnerable, they would swoop on in and offer him a boatload of money. So instead of throwing away their money on a bunch of wrestlers that really don't make much of a difference, I think they should heavily invest in Dwayne Johnson instead. Now sure, I will fully admit that I'm working with the benefit of hindsight, but that's how this game works. And once they have him, they would use him as a diamond in the rough, and they would also play into his former WWF status by having him join the NWO as the young up-and-comer with the rest of the wrestlers who used to work for Vince McMahon. Meanwhile, the on-camera storyline would be that Hulk Hogan was prepping him to become the next big thing. All the while, he was really just exploiting him and using him. But this would all blow up in Hogan's face when it's revealed that The Rock was really using Hogan the entire time, resulting in him taking over the NWO and facing off against Hogan one-on-one. And as all this is happening, The Rock is developing his mic skills and developing his heel persona, all in the name of taking the title off of Hollywood Hulk Hogan and becoming the new leader of the New World Order. Now, if this sounds suspiciously a lot like what happened to him in the Nation of Domination, you're absolutely right, I'm straight up stealing it. And so, if he was able to carry the WWF without Austin, then it's fair to assume he probably could have done the same for World Championship Wrestling, and possibly even be that general to win the war for WCW. Well, there you go, my strategy on how I think WCW might just have bested that of the WWF. But what do you think it would have taken? Let me know down in the comments, and please make sure that you're a fan of the Thinking Fans channel by subscribing here and also giving this video a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all the wonderful Patreon supporters. Thank you so much for all your help. And as always, Dave knows.